This episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by our NordVPN affiliate link. Nord is the industry leader in providing military-grade internet privacy by directing your internet traffic through a secure and encrypted VPN tunnel. To secure 72% off a 2-year subscription to NordVPN today, follow our affiliate link in the show notes page or navigate to libertyweekly.net/Nord. That's libertyweekly.net/NORD.
I want people to know that I do, even at my age, sometimes you do say, maybe I was thinking about this the wrong way. And that is the subject of thick and thin libertarianism. And with you being the guest, I'm going to let you describe what that is, and then we'll talk about what's the correct way to approach libertarianism, thick or thin.
Yeah, and this is part of the problem, Tom. There's so many different uses of the phrase, and they divide them so differently that sometimes when you're talking to some people, the obvious conclusion is no, we want to stay very clear of what might be called thick libertarianism. And other times it sounds somewhat reasonable or sounds somewhat necessary, because sometimes the phrases are couched in terms of, well, do you have other beliefs or convictions or things besides propositions related to the non-aggression principle and their logically implied deductions? Do you have any other beliefs? Well, of course, everyone does, right? So if you phrase it like that, and if that's how you're going to describe thick libertarianism, then there's no such thing as a thin libertarianism. It's impossible. The problem is that the debate has morphed in such a way as there has been, accusations from self-described thick libertarians that the strict or plumb line libertarians, as Walter Block would call them, they accuse people like that of dismissing all of everything related to the worldview and the foundations of thick libertarianism. They accuse them of not being proper libertarians because they don't hold to certain social ideas that are, perhaps more trendy than others.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Patrick McFarland, appearing as always with the co-host, Jerry McCollum.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay, Jerry, so today we're going to be talking about thick and thin libertarianism and how it relates to a recent controversy involving a speech that Jeff Deist gave at the 2017 Mises Summer Program. The speech caused quite a stir in the libertarian community, and we wanted to share our perspective on it.
But first, we're going to be discussing an important idea that's related to this, which is thick versus thin libertarianism.
And for you out there in the audience who have never heard of this concept before, thick and thin libertarianism has several definitions, but the one that I have heard is that thick libertarianism is when you attach other cultural ideas and opinions onto the principles of non-aggression.
Yeah, so everyone that I've heard talking about thick versus thin libertarianism, which we'll be doing this as well, begins the talk by prefacing it and saying that the definitions of thick and thin libertarianism are broad and move around quite a bit and are pretty wishy-washy. So there are some people who define thin libertarianism in a way where any libertarian would be a thin libertarian. And there are people that define thick libertarianism in a way that would mean any libertarian is a thick libertarian. And, well, I think that's obvious that those definitions aren't useful since we're trying to use these labels to distinguish between groups. So the most useful definition of thick and thin libertarianism that we've come across is a thin libertarian is someone who thinks of libertarianism as being only about the non-aggression principle and about when it's, it's about the political theory of when it's okay to use violence or not. And a thick libertarian would say that libertarianism is about the non-aggression principle and other things. Like, usually people talk about ideas of equality, and though, like, usually people say something like, if you're a a thick libertarian would normally say something like, if you're a libertarian, you also have to believe in equality among races or genders or those sort of things.
I've also heard thick libertarians talk about social justice and income inequality and stuff like that. But to be fair, and we wanted to talk about this and bring this up too, is that thick libertarians don't only exist on the left spectrum of libertarianism, is that you can also have culturally right thick libertarians.
And I think that we've been seeing more and more of those recently. So people who think, I would say that a thick libertarian on the right is someone who talks about Western values as being necessary and wholly a part of libertarianism, which I don't think is the case. I think they go hand in hand, but I think that you can not have Western cultural values and be a libertarian. So just to be clear, since we skipped over this part, we both consider ourselves thin libertarians.
Yes, that would be accurate. And related to what you just said, I know that Stefan Molyneux has exculpated himself a bit from the term libertarian, but would we consider him maybe his mindset of protecting Western values as being something maybe a thick libertarian on the right would hold?
If I haven't watched his content in a long time, so I'm not sure, but if he thinks of it's to be a libertarian or to be an anarcho-capitalist or a voluntarist, you must also uphold Western values or, in air quotes, defend the West, I would say that would be thick libertarianism. But if it's something else, if it's just something that he thinks is to be true, but he doesn't consider it to be a libertarian thing, then I would say that he's not a thick libertarian, because we both have a lot of beliefs that exist outside of libertarianism, and that we've brought up on this podcast before, but we don't think that it's something that's necessarily a part of libertarianism, and that's the really important difference.
And I don't want to, having said that, I don't want to put words in Stefan Molyneux's mouth about what he believes now or what he thinks, but to nail down the solid definition before we go forward, this is the one that I wrote down in preparation for the show here. And I'm kind of getting it from an episode that Tom Woods did a few months ago on this issue. I think it was about 5 months ago, which I'll include in the show notes page, but this was the definition. The question is, do you have any other beliefs beyond the non-aggression principle and their logically implied deductions? So that would be the question. And if you have any beliefs beyond that, and you would say this is an essential part of libertarianism, then you're a thick libertarian. And if for you libertarianism is just about the non-aggression principle and their logically implied deductions, then you're a thin libertarian. And my question is, where does individualism come into play here? Does being a thin libertarian, do you have to use individualist axioms? Like, is that part of being a libertarian? So if the left would argue for social justice, and they can do that, that's fine and dandy, I disagree with them, I would still consider them libertarians, because, we're not out to make enemies here, we're here to have a discussion. And we can say from a thin libertarian standpoint that their arguments for social justice is not part of libertarianism. Is that a statement we can make?
Yes, I would say so.
A fair statement we could make.
Mm-hmm.
Can we call them not libertarians because they would argue for those things?
No, I wouldn't say so. If they uphold the non-aggression principle, if they don't want to use state violence against any, if they don't, if they're a minarchist and they don't want to use state violence for anything besides defending crimes with victims, preventing crimes with victims, then I would say that they're a libertarian.
Yeah.
Talking about individualism, I would say that when it comes to a political sense, when it comes to whether or not you should be using violence against someone, then I think that I think libertarianism is inherently individualist when it comes to dealing with law. But outside of that, I think it has nothing to say on there. So I think that I don't think that libertarianism, when it comes to, let's say, cultures or different groups of people, as long as it's not a question of how the law should affect them, then I would say that you can be a libertarian and be collectivist.
Interesting. Yeah. But that being said, well, I was going to say too, because the Liberty Weekly podcast is not out to cause division in the libertarian community. I have friends, specifically personal friends, and I'm thinking of Charlie Gers, who was in episode 9, the first guest on the show, who I know would identify as a left libertarian, and I still consider him to be a libertarian, even though he would argue for those, and I would argue too on my own end, because I'm a little more culturally conservative. I wouldn't try and attach my principles to libertarianism itself, but I would still argue maybe for them in a certain sense. But I wanted to make that clear distinction because we do have friends of the show on the left side that I would still consider libertarians.
Yeah, so if it's not clear, we're not here to make enemies, and I think that's really important. Recently we've been seeing a lot of infighting within the anarcho-capitalist groups, and I don't know about you, but personally I'm getting kind of tired of it.
It depresses me. It really does, and I hate to see it because how are we ever going to accomplish anything if all we do is infight? And maybe
and just to be clear, there's a difference between disagreeing and debating with each other and infighting, because what I see is a lot of people shitting on each other now and not actually having a discussion in any way.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that, and it's been tough to see, to be honest. While my sympathies certainly lie with the Mises Institute, because as I've stated on the podcast before, Jeff Deist is maybe my hero or Jeff Deist is someone that I look up to personally as an attorney in my professional life, and I agree with a lot of what he says. And this is kind of transitioning into that, and I don't know if we want to get there yet. But even though I'm a large supporter of the Mises Institute, and I will defend them, I'm not here to call Fee or Cato not libertarians because of this, We're treading on, thin ice in a certain sense, and I just don't want to.
We want to make it clear that we're trying to tread lightly.
Yeah, and in fact, in the episode, the Tom Woods episode I was referring to, Tom Woods says that he is very irritated when people call each other not libertarian unless it is so overtly
Bill Weld.
Yeah, so overtly, and I know Charlie would disagree with you on that.
Yeah,
but that's a conversation for a different day. But. Yeah, so that's enlightening, though, because I did have this critique of left libertarianism, and I think you're right that maybe I can't call them not libertarian for advocating social justice, but we can still disagree with them and critique them that way.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's strange. To me, it's always surprising when I see someone who's very much interested in social justice and is a libertarian, because I don't imagine them going hand in hand.
Well, in some of the statements that they make, I would definitely agree with, saying that the system that we have today is not beneficial. It benefits certain groups,
certain
demographics, maybe not groups, disproportionately. But maybe they would agree with me in equating that problem to the Fed or to minimum wage laws or to the war on drugs, so if we're disagreeing, about that analysis, well, the solution is always the same. You end the war on drugs, you repeal minimum wage laws. We don't need affirmative action for this. We just need to remove the structure. Mm-hmm. That being said, this infighting gets us nowhere. I think generally we would agree on the solutions. I mean, that would be it. So why, I guess tactics in getting there would be something that we could talk about. Mm-hmm. How you affect this change in repealing minimum wage laws, or what order you do it in. I know we would be privy to the argument that any way, at any time you can shrink the state, go for it. Mm-hmm. So what's with all the fighting? and we'll get to Jeff Deist's speech in a little bit here.
So recently, I would say within the, definitely around the time of Trump becoming a president until now, we've started to see I would call it a conservative libertarian faction, for lack of a better term, that's becoming stronger and stronger. And I think that they very much at times are guilty of being
thick libertarians.
Yeah. But, like Facebook groups and those sort of things that I see, there's a lot of people who talk about you can't be a libertarian and be on the left. They're a contradiction in terms. And I think that that's incorrect. I think that, there's a lot of people who talk about you can't be a libertarian and be for open borders, which I think that's really silly, and clearly they're guilty of being thick libertarians there, and I think that they're incorrect because of that. They can't be making claims about who is or is not a libertarian based on their beliefs outside of the non-aggression principle.
I'd agree, and I'd have to say, despite me, I guess, complaining, for lack of a better term, about all the infighting that's happening, even through the 2 or 3 months that we've had this podcast going, have formed and solidified opinions about things, because I was more privy, specifically the open borders thing. I was more privy to, we can't open the borders until A, B, and C happens. Mm-hmm. And I think now I'm more on the open borders side of it, saying that we need to do what we can when we can, and that the issue, we've talked about this, so I'll link in the show notes page.
I just remember seeing and it was a meme, so this isn't necessarily an legitimate argument that someone's making, but just saw so many image macros of people saying that open borders are communist. And it's like, what? Have you looked at a communist country? Do they have open borders? Because they don't. It was really bizarre to me seeing that, and I don't understand what they were thinking.
Yeah. Well, in that whole debate gets really convoluted too, but our position is that it's not an open borders issue. It is a drug war issue. It is a welfare issue. End those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's focus our effort on that.
Drug welfare, foreign policy issue, since what's called the immigrant crisis in Europe is caused by the wars created in the Middle East
and some shady non-governmental organizations. We Are Change. We'll link to that. I think Luke Rudkowski has had the best coverage, besides maybe Sibel Edmonds and Newsbud, of the immigration crisis that I've ever seen. So I'll link that if you want to get into that. But what I was saying before we talked about open borders was that through the podcast, I've had good conversations with people that haven't been about infighting, that have solidified and shaped my opinions on these issues. And so that has been beneficial. So if we're looking for a ray of hope, or, a little brightness, or
silver lining.
A little silver lining, thank you.
Yeah.
That would be my silver lining to this situation. But before we get into the Jeff Deist speech situation, let's pause for a moment to talk about how we can financially bring this podcast to you.
If you are browsing the internet without the secure encrypted protection of NordVPN, your web traffic is completely vulnerable to third-party observation. NordVPN is the industry leader in secure and private VPN technology, offering military-grade encryption to keep your internet traffic secure. Take advantage of our special offer today and receive 72% off a 2-year subscription by following our link in the show notes page, or by navigating to libertyweekly.net/Nord. That's libertyweekly.net/NORD.
So recently, Jeff Deist gave a speech that I think colloquially is known as the blood and soil speech now. And there's been...
Which is Orwellian.
Yeah, which there's been a lot of controversy about. There's a lot of people who are, I would say, strawmanning Jeff Deist and, giving their opinions. And in a sense, some people are drawing lines in the sand from what I've seen. And what people are claiming is that Jeff Deist in this speech is making some of the more ridiculous statements that I've heard is that he's making an appeal to the alt-right, or that he's making an appeal to fascists, which is, I think that's clearly not the case. And we'll explain why in a little bit. But other people are saying that he's making an argument on that he is being a thick libertarian, and that he is saying that libertarianism needs to become more conservative and needs to embrace conservatism, and we don't think that's what he's saying at all. But that's an argument that we've heard quite a bit lately, and we're here to give what we have to say about it and what we think is what Jeff Deist actually was trying to say. So to begin, we're going to start with an excerpt from the infamous speech that we're going to be talking about, and this is we're gonna go right to the juicy quote at the end about containing the words blood and soil, just so you can get an example. You can know what we're talking about if you haven't listened to the speech already, which I suggest that you listen to it in full.
And if you don't have enough time to listen to it in full, we'll also include the text version of the speech, which is a lot faster to go through.
As the title of my talk suggests, what I'd like to talk about this afternoon for us, this evening for you, is not libertarianism per se or so much, but libertarians themselves. And I'd like to ask you all to consider whether libertarians perhaps have lost their way. So we have this fantastic, airtight Rothbardian theory of liberty, but it turns out it's not enough. And Murray himself acknowledged this both at the end of For New Liberty and at the end of The Ethics of Liberty. Both books contain a section on strategy at the end. And he was really the first to stress the importance of people and activism, not just ideas and education. But what kind of people and what kind of activism? That's the question that he labored under, and it's still the question today, I think. So I'd like to offer a few suggestions and ideas about libertarians and what libertarians ought to do to move us closer to Murray's vision. And I think one of the most important things we can do to better sell or promote liberty is to make the overriding point that liberty is natural and organic, and it comports with human action. It doesn't require a new man. Libertarians have this bad tendency of falling into utopianism, into portraying liberty as something new and evolved. And in this way, we tend to sound a lot like progressives. Liberty will start to work when humans finally shed their old ideas about family and tribe and become purely rationalistic free thinkers, a term I hate. It always means the opposite. Have you noticed this? Free thinker is never a good thing in my experience. But when we become purely rational free thinkers and reject all this mythology of religion and faith, and when we start to give up our outdated ethnic or nationalist or cultural alliances, it will accept the new hyper-individualist creed. So in addition to portraying libertarianism as something more natural and organic that comports with our nature, I think we make a huge mistake when we fail to embrace the institutions of civil society. And I think this is something that's been a nagging part of libertarianism really since its modern incarnation in the 1960s and 70s. So civil society itself, let's think about that for a second. Libertarians enthusiastically embrace markets, but for decades we've made this disastrous mistake of appearing hostile to family, to tradition, to religion, to culture, to civic and social institutions. In other words, hostile to civil society itself, which is bizarre if we think about it, because civil society provides the very mechanisms we need to organize society without the state. And in keeping with Rothbard's point about liberty and human nature, civil society organizes itself organically without force. That's the definition of civil society. It stands apart from pure markets and the state. Human beings want to be part of something larger than themselves. And why do we fail to grasp this decade after decade? And one thing that's bigger than ourselves for many of us is family. It scarcely needs to be said that family has always been the first line of defense and the most important source of primary loyalty, or divided loyalty from the perspective of politicians who don't much like family structures. Our connection with our ancestors and our concern for our progeny form a story. These two things form a story in which the state is not the main character. The state's not even in the story. But it remains true that civil society should be celebrated by libertarians at every turn. To believe otherwise is to ignore what humans actually want and what humans actually do, which is create communities larger than themselves. The third point I'd like to make tonight is about politics and what libertarians ought to be thinking and doing politically. Again, there's this stubborn tendency amongst libertarians to advocate some sort of universal political arrangement. To the extent there's any political end for libertarians, it's allowing individuals to live as they see fit. The political goal is self-determination, and we get this by reducing the size and the scope and the power of government wherever we might be. But the idea of universal libertarian principles has somehow become mixed up with the idea of universal libertarian politics. And I think because of this, what most of us think of as live and let live libertarianism has been replaced by a doctrine of universal libertarian thought, oftentimes coupled or superimposed with a cultural element. And because of this, again, libertarians often fall into a trap of sounding an awful lot like conservatives and progressives in the sense that they imagine themselves qualified to dictate how political arrangements ought to be made anywhere on the globe. But what's libertarian about telling other countries what to do? Shouldn't our political goal be radical self-determination, not universal values? So I'll end with this. What would you, everyone in this room here and in Malta tonight, what would you fight for? And I think the answer to this question tells us a lot about what libertarians ought to care about. And by this, I mean, what would you physically fight for, where doing so could mean serious injury or death, getting killed, or arrest and imprisonment, and the loss of your home, your money, your possessions? That's a good question. I'm sure all of us would fight for our physical persons if we were attacked on the street. We'd fight for our family's physical persons if they were attacked. We'd probably fight for our close friends and extended family too. And we might even fight for our neighbors if they were physically attacked. In fact, we'd probably like to think, most of us, that we would defend a total stranger physically in some instances if you saw an older person being robbed or beaten up. We'd like to think that we'd intervene physically and risk harm. And if we expand this out a little bit, you might fight for your town or your community if it was physically attacked or invaded by some kind of outside force. Even if you didn't personally know all the people in your town and community, you might band together for that. And to an extent, we might fight for our property too, not just our bodies, maybe not as fiercely. We'd certainly fight to protect our homes, but that's because we care about the people inside. How about our cars? Would you physically mix it up with a car thief who was driving away with your car, assuming probably a he, was armed? Or would you just let him go and not risk death or injury to save your car? How about your wallet? How about if somebody stuck a gun in your face and asked for your wallet? How about somebody stealing 40% of your income every 2 weeks, as many governments do? Would you take up arms to prevent this? I mean, we can look around and say that clearly we would look around and say, clearly, everyone in Malta is a courageous badass based on that. But how about an abstraction? Would you fight for an abstraction like your country or freedom or your religion? This is where things get a little more tenuous. Now, many people, I don't want to disparage anyone, lots of people have fought for abstractions. But it's interesting, if you ask soldiers who have been in combat situations about what they fought for in the heat of an actual battle, they'll oftentimes tell you that they were fighting for the protection of their immediate mates in the actual unit. They were fighting to protect the men in their units and to fulfill some sort of personal sense of duty that they would have felt terrible if everyone during World War II had gone off to war and they hadn't, or if their friends and family were being put in danger and they weren't. So, in other words, blood and soil and God and nation still matter to people. And I think libertarians ignore this at the risk of irrelevance. Thank you very much.
What I believe is that Jeff Deist was talking about changing tactics. It wasn't talking about changing libertarianism. What he was saying was that libertarians should not eschew tribalism, all the different kind of things that he's referencing, the different communities and conservative values, I would all put under one umbrella as tribalism. He's saying that libertarians shouldn't eschew tribalism because it matters to a lot of people. And if libertarianism is portrayed as anti-tribalist, which it is not inherently, although many of its members are, including myself, that libertarianism will be a harder sell to the public and will accomplish less. And that's what he's saying. He's not saying libertarians need to be conservative. He's not saying libertarianism needs to become more fascist. He's not saying that I wouldn't even go so far as saying that, people on the left, that he's demonizing libertarians on the left. He's just saying that libertarians need to stop acting like libertarianism is anti-tribal, and because it hurts its dissemination. And then I wouldn't know if I would necessarily saying that the dissemination of like the most pure Rothbardian ideas, but it'd be hurting the dissemination of even just the more benign ideas like, hey, the drug war is bad, or we shouldn't be invading foreign countries, and those sort of things.
And I do think that those at the Mises Institute are more right in their own personal convictions. And I think maybe that's where some people got the impression that Jeff Deist was advocating for conservatism. Because I do think that socially, Jeff Deist is a conservative, or Jeff Deist has conservative values. He's of the right.
Yeah.
He has conservative values. And I would say that I am of the right. Like, I personally, in my own life, I like family structures. I don't care what it's composed of, but I think that individuals need to have a family unit, or at least a friend and family supportive unit. But I digress. I think that it's one thing to disagree with what Jeff Deist is saying, and I can respect that position. If you do not strawman him,
if you think that the tactic that he's describing is not a good one, then
I get it.
I get
Make
that argument.
And I disagree with you, but I get it. If you are calling him a Nazi or saying that he is advocating for libertarians to be more conservative, then I think you're missing the point. At the best, you're missing the point, and at the worst, you're willfully mischaracterizing what he's saying. And I would disagree with that.
And it's really unfortunate that we've got, all this name calling going around right now. And I would just hope that we would be better than that, but I guess not, which is, we're only human. And just to be clear, I actually don't have any opinion on whether or not I agree with Jeff Deist's speech. I haven't really thought about it. I don't know if this is a good tactic for libertarianism or not, but I'm not saying that Jeff Deist is talking about libertarianism needs to be more conservative. He's not saying that libertarianism needs to be more fascist or more tribalistic. He's just saying that we shouldn't disregard those things in other communities, in our own community.
And I think that what he's saying, and the part of it that I would agree with, is that we need to be practical and realize that the rest of the world is not libertarian. We do not need to make the world cultural, universal libertarians. We need to reach people where they are. And we need to realize that a lot of people, that these things still matter to them, like tribalism. And we talked about this before, but I really wanted to run that home, that I feel like he's saying we need to reach people where they are and be more practical and realistic about this. And realize that we don't need to make the world into Rothbardians.
Yeah. And I would agree with that, I would say.
Yeah. But one thing that I also wanted to bring up is that what I really think that Jeff Deist is advocating for is a type of agorism, which is more of on the left libertarian concept. And we mentioned this before we went on a hot mic, but I think that if agorism is, and I hope I'm not misconstruing agorism, and if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong.
And let us know.
Yeah, and let us know politely, please. I think that if agorism is about community building and making the state obsolete, I think what Jeff Deist is talking about is agorism is talking about civil institutions that exist beyond the scope of government that tie people together. And I think that would be something that agorists would be into. Maybe because I'm not an agorist per se myself. So.
I believe that is the case, that,
they just maybe wouldn't like church institutions. If I'm thinking,
or they might call their institutions different. And again, unfortunately, we don't quite know enough about agorism to be really precise here. But
not as if we were agorists ourselves. Yeah.
But I do think that those are that community building and creating organizations explicitly outside of the state is something that agorists are in favor of. And something that I think is important too is that Jeff Deist is not saying that we need to water down our principles, or, for example, like we don't need to touch on the recent election, we don't need to be more electable. We don't need to show libertarianism to be, we don't need to advocate for baking cakes, and those sort of things. But it's just to, at least this is my interpretation of his speech. It's just that we need to not shit on other people's tribalism. We need to not say that that's wrong or evil or it needs to go away. That's what he's arguing. He's not saying that we need to sell libertarianism as something that it isn't, which I think that's important, because I know that, including myself, a lot of people, including myself, are pretty annoyed at the actions of the Libertarian Party, the National Libertarian Party, in the most recent election. And I think that what he's advocating for is wholly different than a moderating of the libertarian position.
So to sum up this episode, before we go here, we started with explaining the difference between thick and thin libertarianism, and explain within our definition of those terms why we would identify as thin libertarians. And then we talked a lot about how we really don't want to divide the movement, and that as long as you believe in non-aggression and the logically derived conclusions of the non-aggression principle, we consider you to be a libertarian. And I will walk down the road with anyone that wants to end or diminish the state for any reason. So we want to be a force uniting all different libertarians together, trying to accomplish something, whether it's community building or, advocating non-aggression.
Or even repealing policy.
Exactly. And so we ended with the very controversial Jeff Deist speech. We would love to hear what you have to say about this, what you think. Specifically, however, I want to set a Twitter policy because I've gotten into a few Twitter conversations, not specifically with listeners, and I'll address this a little more. We have an interview coming up that we're doing in a few minutes here with Dean, who produces his own content at Dino Files. And so we're going to have him on the show and talk a little bit about debating. But just to preface that, I am not going to get into any Twitter arguments with anyone for a few reasons, because I don't think they're a good use of time. It's very hard to nail down what someone is talking about in 120 characters. And so it's not that I'm mad or
that you don't want to debate, it's that you think it's a poor platform to use.
Exactly. And so if you want to correct us on something,
use the SpeakPipe app on our page,
yeah,
and we can put you directly into the podcast. Or if you want to go even farther, you can try and get on the show, which we'd be very excited to have any of our listeners on. But what really Pat is trying to say is that Twitter is not a good place to debate people, and that he doesn't want to do it on there anymore.
Exactly. So it's not that I don't want to debate, but yes. So I'd appreciate if you guys especially would reach out to us on SpeakPipe, or send me an email or something, and we can hash it out. But I think a lot of the disagreements that I've noticed that I've been having with people are due to semantics, and we actually do agree. So what happens on Twitter is that we argue around a point for an hour, and then realize that we were talking about the same thing all along, and we really do agree. And I just think that's a waste of time. But a few announcements, some of the normal housekeeping stuff as we go close up here. We are still calling for reviews, written reviews, or ratings on Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play Music, any platform that you're listening to us here. We really do appreciate that, and we are very much appreciative of the listeners that have already given us written reviews on iTunes. It just really helps us out a whole lot. Also, we're still asking the audience to sign up for our email list so that you can get copies of our free ebooks and get a little more personal connection to me, where I'll send you some anecdotes about current events. You'll get copies of our ebooks, personalized email updates, and some other bonus content there. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for listening. We probably do consider you a libertarian. So we hope that this episode clarified some of the issues that are going around, and we hope that it will serve to kind of bring the community a little closer together, or at least our little corner of it, because we're better together as opposed to being fragmented little groups. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, Pat McFarland here. As a listener of the Liberty Weekly podcast, you have probably heard of our feature program Thought Crime Thursdays. If you enjoy perusing the world of dystopian fiction, you will love the course Sci-Fi, Liberty, and Dystopia. Taught by Professor Brad Berzer, a frequent guest on The Tom Woods Show, Sci-Fi, Liberty, and Dystopia is one of the most popular courses available exclusively through Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Correspondingly, it is also where I have been drawing inspiration for future installments of Thought Crime Thursdays. To gain access to this course and 18 others taught by top libertarian professors, join through our affiliate link by navigating to libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom, or follow the link in the show notes page.